It's a real joy to welcome all of you this evening to the annual Richard W. Smith Civil War History Lecture Series. Melissa and I, within just the last hour, have returned from having been in Boston and Washington, D.C., visiting with alumni. And I was thinking as we returned from the airport how often it is as we travel around the country to meet alumni of Ohio Wesleyan, we get this question: how are Dick and Betty Smith? And invariably then I hear stories of what it was like to be in Dick's classroom. And then I hear stories of what it has been like through a lifetime in business, in public service, in community leadership, in family decisions, to reflect on the lessons learned in Dick's classroom, and in particular, on those lessons learned in the study of the Civil War. I'd like everyone in the room who was a student of Dick Smith to stand. Dick, this is your legacy. We have Dave Papoy, a former trustee. We have John Bassett, a former two-time college president, retired, couldn't give it up, went back. He finally now says he is retired. And when I looked up and saw John and Kay walk in, what a thrill to have both of you back at your alma mater this evening, and so many others who are here for this gathering. Each year, we have the opportunity to extend the legacy of Dick Smith through this lecture series, which stands as a permanent gift of his former students who want for the future what they had so long ago. The follow-up question that often comes is, so is it still the same today? Do our students today have access to the same teacher scholars that we knew when we were at Ohio Wesleyan? Dick's former students don't say "oh woo," they say Ohio Wesleyan. And I assure them that it is. It is true in the history department, but it is true across the campus. And so it's my great pleasure now to introduce Dick's successor in the teaching of the Civil War, Professor Barbara Turgeon.
Well, I want to welcome you on behalf of the history department, of course. And I think you all know I am not Dick Smith. No one possibly could be. And so I'm honored to teach the Civil War class. And indeed, Professor Waugh and I have something in common in that we got jobs. We were so excited to get jobs. And they were 19th century U.S. history jobs. And you know what? They came with teaching the Civil War. And both of us, in talking to each other the last few days, said how we wound up loving teaching this class. It's my favorite class. And why? Because it's just it's full of drama. It's full of, for me, I was talking to her and I was saying, the contingent moments of war. Anyway, it's just a very rich history. And so she and I both came to teaching the Civil War in the same way. We got a job. So let me also say, though, that I know, many of you are regulars and you'll be coming here for a long, long time. And as you know, 2011 to 2015, we were tracking the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Well, we're still tracking extraordinary history that happened 150 years ago. So before I turn to more of a description of Dr. Waugh, why she's the perfect speaker this year, I want to say to you that 150 years ago this month, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in the United States was not even quite 2 years old. There was a 14th Amendment that Congress had sent out to the states, and that amendment had not yet been ratified. In fact, it had stalled at 22 states ratifying it, and it needed 28. What was that 14th Amendment going to do? Well, it said, among other things, if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States. Because the U.S. Supreme Court had said in 1857 that no African Americans, free for generations, whatever, was a citizen of the United States. And then it has these very famous protections, very famous protections. No state can take away the rights of being a citizen of the United States. No state can deny a person due process to protect your life, liberty, property. No state can deny equal protection under the law. So it had gotten stalled, and the president at that time was explicitly opposed to it getting ratified. That president was Andrew Johnson, who, as you all know, became president by virtue of being vice president under Lincoln. And what looked like a good decision in 1864 to make him vice president, by 1867, by this moment in time, 150 years ago, no. And so he was in a battle with Lincoln's party, Republicans in Congress. He had just narrowly escaped getting impeached by the House, but he was president. And guess who his Secretary of War was? Grant. So let's think about this. Within 6 months, Grant's going to resign as Secretary of War. Those impeachment articles are going to come out of the House. He's going to be tried about 8 months later, not convicted. And then, we're just a little less than, about a year from now would be the 150th anniversary of Grant becoming president. So incredibly important times then. And so that is the beauty of the talk that we're going to get tonight. Charlottesville had not happened when we selected Professor Waugh for this speech, but she is going to be talking to you about Grant, soldier and statesman, and she had a research question. I know that any historians you feel like, oh, they know everything or they think they know everything. Well, it's not actually true because we always start our projects with a question that we cannot answer. We start every research project with a question we cannot answer. And so I'm so happy to introduce you Dr. Waugh tonight because she had a brilliant insight. And that was knowing that Grant had been so revered on his death, so revered. What happened in the 20th century that he began to be held in less repute? That Lee gets exalted and Grant's reputation goes this way. And so it's the answer to that will be part of her talk tonight. And I want to say, I've told her this personally, I want to say this to you. She had a brilliant insight. She had the courage and the conviction of her insight to write the book. And believe me, imagine what it was like to suggest, I have an insight about Grant. How many books have been written about Grant? I want to approach it as a biography with social history. How many people were encouraging about that? Very few. And she wrote this really, as we say in history, this really important book. So with that, I would like for you to please thank Dr. Waugh for being with us tonight.
Good evening. I have had the most marvelous day and a half coming to my first visit to Columbus and to Delaware and to Ohio Wesleyan. And I thank Barbara Turgeon for her kindness and expertise. I thank Joe Glatar, a student of Dick Smith, for recommending me to come to be a speaker in this wonderful series of lectures. And of course, I feel that I've been initiated into some secret society, the Dick and Betty Smith Club, which has many members, and I'm still, my head is spinning. I don't know even if I'm going to be able to get through the lecture. Oh yes, I will, don't worry about that. But I have to say, I had a lot of respect for Professor Smith because my friend Joe Glatar, and of course I've met many of his other students here, and it's been a real delight, but I didn't really understand the full force of Dick Smith until I met him in the history department the other day, and I'm just really blown away His record of inspirational teaching remains the gold standard for the rest of us. And I thank you so much, Dick and Betty, for welcoming me here. I have also really enjoyed walking around campus, and I had the pleasure on Thursday to see the beautiful campus, but also to drop in Professor Turgeon's classroom, Civil War classrooms, and some of the students are here. And I talked to them and asked them questions, and they asked me questions, and I have to say, they're a great bunch. You should be proud of your students, and those of you who are students should be proud to be at this university. I'm going to start my lecture now, just giving you a heads up, but as I prepared my talk and thought about where I was, Ohio, I can't tell you how much I've been to Ohio before, never in Columbus or Delaware, but I have been many times, and Ohio, as you all know, is absolutely essential. The history of Ohio is essential to understanding 19th century America and certainly the Civil War. Ohio was third in the northern states in supplying manpower for the Union. The three big Union heroes were all born and raised in Ohio. That would be Philip Sheridan, William Tecumseh Sherman, and of course Grant, which is the topic of my paper tonight, my lecture tonight. And I just want to give you a heads up at how the lecture is going to progress. I do have a PowerPoint presentation that will aid, I think, in the enjoyment I insist you all have from my lecture. And the lecture itself, my talk itself, is divided up into three parts. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to General and President Grant. Some of you I know Grant well, others have no idea who he is or very little idea. I might also refresh some memories as well, just give you a brief introduction. And then I'm going to look at General and President Grant in American historical memory, that fickle thing we call how we honor our icons or forget them. The third part is Grant's revision. I believe that now, and actually for some time, 15 years, perhaps you're unaware of it, but it is a time of revision for Grant. And I'm going to look at him as a soldier statesman and also discuss the ways in which historians, myself included, have explored and uncovered and maybe recovered Grant's importance to American history. Commanding General of the Union Army and 18th President of the United States, U.S. Grant, like George Washington and Dwight D. Eisenhower, was both a professional warrior of a defining war and a twice elected president. And like Washington and Eisenhower, he dominated his era, which in his case encompassed both the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, its aftermath. From 1862 to 1876, he was at the center of national life. One reason mid-19th century Americans revered Grant, and this is a typical medal that was struck both during his generalship, linking him and after his presidency with Washington, Lincoln, and then Grant, the three big guys, was because of it. People liked him because of his humble background, which proved, like Abraham Lincoln's, that ordinary individuals are seemingly ordinary individuals, because neither Grant nor Lincoln were ordinary, but they could rise to extraordinary heights. You didn't have to be rich. You didn't have to go to Harvard. You didn't have to be a big deal in New York City. You could rise to the heights of American power. And I think that story should inspire today's Americans as well. Grant was raised on the Ohio frontier. He was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, and moved to Georgetown. He was educated at West Point. He was a veteran of the Mexican War. This is Grant in his cadet uniform. And he was also became a hard-working farmer who built his family a log house. There's probably no other president that has ever built a log house for his family to live in, but Grant did. Grant was working as a clerk in a leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, owned by his father, when he answered President Lincoln's call for volunteers in that first spring of the American Civil War. Although fame and fortune, you might say, had eluded this modest man, which has prompted many writers about Grant to think of him as a pre-war failure, he declared firmly and proudly for the Union. He was 39 years old when the war began, and he did not dwell in obscurity for long, gaining fame in Tennessee and Mississippi with a string of victories that included Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. Now, he did not rise to his position without controversy. Few powerful people do. He suffered attacks on his character and generalship during the war, during his presidency, and he did make mistakes, many mistakes. Absorbing all the setbacks, though, that came his way, absorbing all the disappointments that came his way, Grant was able to display a calmness and confidence throughout the war as throughout his life. He tended to accept the reality of the situation and move on to the next challenge. Grant's rare winning record among Union generals, if you know anything about the Civil War, you know that Lincoln was in agony the first year of the war with his generals, a set of generals in the Eastern Theater who, like, dare I say, George McClellan, I understand you learned about him a few years ago, who just would not move aggressively, just seemed not to want to fight. And Grant was different. Grant actually was aggressive. Grant secured victories, and Lincoln liked him from the very beginning. He was promoted to lieutenant general in March of 1864, and Grant took over the strategic direction of the war, managing victories that guaranteed Lincoln's re-election and the end of the conflict. The Union's hero was praised for his generous terms of surrender he offered to Robert E. Lee, one of the most famous paintings, historical paintings that we have, the surrender at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865. Together, the top general, Grant, and the president, Lincoln, who saw the war through and united their destinies, were going to oversee what both knew would be an extraordinarily difficult transition period. A week after Appomattox, President Lincoln was assassinated. Shortly afterwards, Grant became the first four-star general in U.S. history, remaining as head of the Army until nominated for president by the Republican Party in 1868. Then Grant, aided by the newly enfranchised Southern African American men in states reconstructed by Congress, swept to victory with his famous campaign slogan, "Let us have peace." Once in office, the president, there he is in his civilian clothes, proved to be a strong supporter of African American civil rights, as he was during the war, a strong supporter of emancipation and black soldiers. He proudly signed off on the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870, describing the law enabling black suffrage as, quote, "a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day." After leaving the presidency, Grant made a triumphal tour of the world for 2 years, 1877, 1879, the first ex-president to travel so widely. He went to every country in Europe, and And he traveled to India, to China, and Japan. He was greeted as a military hero and the leader of an emerging democratic global power. Millions of people all across the world came out to see the ex-president of the United States. Retiring to New York City, the ex-president lost his entire savings in a financial scandal. He wasn't good with money ever, and he was reduced to poverty. To earn money, he agreed to write about his wartime experiences for a popular journal called Century Magazine. These articles that he wrote for Century were spectacularly successful and became widely read. And they were so popular that he decided to write his military memoirs almost the same time that he was diagnosed with throat cancer. And the year 1884, 1885 saw him struggling with the disease. This is a very famous picture of him finishing his memoirs at a place called Mount McGregor, New York, where he did die there. And he completed the writing of his autobiography, which brought renewed reverence from many citizens, published just after his death. And there you see a copy of the first edition. The 2-volume personal memoirs of U.S. Grant sold 300,000 copies and became a perennial bestseller. It's never gone out of print. And that's saying something. His volumes, what do I think of them? I think they delivered a beautifully rendered narrative of the Civil War from the viewpoint of the man who, after Lincoln, was most closely identified with bringing about United States victory in the war. Although the memoirs were imbued with a spirit of reconciliation between the sections, Grant's account made it clear that it was the Northern cause, union and emancipation, that would forever and should forever remain the morally superior one. The personal memoirs is considered one of the greatest autobiographies in the English language, and it has earned classic status as both literature and history. When Ulysses S. Grant died on July 23rd, 1885, he was the most famous of all Americans, both at home and abroad. More than 1 million people watched his funeral procession in New York City on August 8th, 1885. You see it before you. 13 years later, the dedication of his massive tomb in Manhattan on the 75th anniversary of his birth in April of 1897 drew another 1 million plus. Grant's tomb, the largest in North America, remained New York City's most popular tourist site until 1929. Veterans' generations just dying out around that time. Well, this brief review of Grant shows that he had an important legacy to the making of modern America. And as important and appreciated as his military career would continue to be in the minds of many, by the 1920s, really, a constant drumbeat of criticism had already diminished his reputation. Grant, the savior of the country, had been supplanted by then in the minds of the people by Grant the butcher, Grant the drunk, and Grant the corrupt, incompetent president. How did this happen, and how was this so? And this brings me to a nice bridge to the second part of my lecture on General and President Grant in American historical memory. So how did this happen? Someone who was so high got so low, certainly by the second decade of the 20th century. Well, since the end of the war, and I mean the Civil War, the ex-Confederates were busy writing books. They were busy publishing newspaper articles and giving speeches. Why did they have the right to do this? Because they were now citizens of the United States and they could remember their cause in however way they wanted to. Their version of history is known as the Lost Cause. You've heard of it, I'm sure, after the recent controversy. The Lost Cause can be simply described as this. The cause of the war was not slavery, but state rights. Southern armies were never defeated, but rather overwhelmed by numbers. The Southern soldier was brave and true, echoing the perfection of the patron saint of the lost cause, Robert E. Lee. This is a postcard that I came across in my research. I looked at many visual images as part of my research for my book and researching memory that was very typical. This Commanders-in-Chief, this was a postcard that was popular in the late 19th century. So already Lee was welcomed back into the pantheon of American heroes. And that was a problem for Grant's reputation. And here in a nutshell is what happened. White Southerners thought of themselves as wronged people. They managed to transform their defeat in the war into a proud and defiant sense of their regional specialness and unique identity. Those of us who study memory, and there are many memory studies and scholars who participate in this well beyond the Civil War, it's interesting to note that for lots of people, the past can be alive as the present. And there's something to that saying that if you forget the past, it might condemn people to repeat it. I personally don't put much stock in that, but it might also be true that remembering it too intensely condemns you never to move on with your life. And I think of that often when I read about the reaction of white Southerners to their loss in the Civil War. But it happened, they felt it intensely, and that's fine so far. But it was not enough for many ex-Confederates to idolize Robert E. Lee. U.S. Grant's reputation and the meaning of his cause, the Union cause, which was preservation of the Democratic Republic without slavery, and had to be destroyed or diminished and cut down to size. There's a famous book that was published in 1866 by a Southern journalist named Edward A. Pollard. Guess what it was entitled? The Lost Cause. And here he laid out a lot of the typical argument against Grant. The Union general, Edward Pollard, contended in The Lost Cause, quote, was one of the most remarkable accidents of the war. A man without any marked ability, certainly without genius, without fortune, without influence. You don't want that in your letter of recommendation, I can tell you. To the Lost Cause historians, whose influence, by the way, extended well beyond the Southern boundaries, Grant was the enemy because he had defeated Robert E. Lee and thus Confederate hopes for independence. If they could not defeat Grant on the battlefield, at least they could tear him down in print. And that is what they set out to do. They portrayed him as a man of limited intelligence and inferior military skills. Jubal Early, one of Lee's commanders, who was a leading Lost Cause partisan, summed up the attitude toward Grant with he had a way with words, did Jubal Early, quote, "Shall I compare Lee to his successful antagonist? As well compared the great pyramid which rears its majestic proportions in the valley of the Nile to a pygmy perched on Mount Atlas." Oh, wow. Southern writers and speakers were influential in redirecting attention from Union victory to glorifying Confederate defeat. Some were journalists like Pollard, others important military figures like Early, and all repeatedly attacked Grant's military record battle by battle. Grant's generalship, they claimed, was a fraud. His triumphs in the West, just lucky, the result of happy fate, or more often they blamed their own side, the incompetence of the Western generals. Even though most of Grant's battles in the West were low in terms of casualties, it was Shiloh that they focused on, which was an exception. And that was singled out by them as the harbinger of Grant the Butcher and his willingness, his and Lincoln's willingness to sacrifice their men. Further, their story went, Grant only prevailed in the all-important Eastern Theater because he possessed great and unlimited resources. And this is a big deal. It's still controversial today. How many men did the Union Army had versus how many men did Robert E. Lee have? If you look at just the numbers, the Union Army was far greater. But in terms of the result of this kind of literature and dialogue being common at this time, it had its influence on historians. For example, Winston Churchill, you remember him. He actually, when he wasn't painting and running England and saving the Western world from the Nazis, he was writing history books. And he loved to write about the American Civil War. And he wrote about Grant, and he wrote about Grant's, quote, unflinching butchery, arguing that, quote, more is expected of the high command than determination in thrusting men to their doom. He concluded that Grant's generalship, when compared to, in Churchill's mind, the incomparable Lee, quote, must be regarded as the negation of generalship. Churchill was neither the first nor the last historian to be, in my mind, perversely unaware that Lee lost proportionately more men than Grant in the Overland Campaign. That was the great campaign that pitted the top two generals against each other in 1864. In fact, the truth is that both generals, both General Lee and General Grant, directed campaigns that produce huge casualty rates. If you want to call these generals butchers, Lee deserves that epithet too, although I don't necessarily agree with that. If you wanted to fight and die in the Civil War, you joined the Army of Northern Virginia, that's for sure. And I think that what I just gave you is an example of the distortions that can come with historical memory. Historical is always contains some truth, but there are distortions. There were 4 major memory traditions coming out of the Civil War. They're probably familiar, they're obvious. The Union cause represented by Grant, the Lost cause represented by Lee, the Emancipationist tradition, which is the tradition and that has become the most important historical memory, I think, today, almost on par with reconciliation. So that is what I'm conveying to you here, to think about how memory traditions, how historical memory can be a very, you need to dig deeper. I guess that's what I'm saying. In the 20th century, this is a very famous painting hanging in the National Gallery. If you've ever been there, it's a marvelous place. Huge painting about Grant and his generals. In the 20th century, as Churchill's comments underscore, understanding or appreciation of the Union cause steadily declined. And somehow you can understand, because the United States won. The country remained whole, for maybe not in heart, but at least in reality. And it wasn't as important, perhaps, I'm sure that didn't happen in Ohio, but in other places, the memory faded a bit. And this attractive mythic romanticism of Southern nobility embodied by Lee was very attractive. It seems that that we have forgotten as a country why so many people sacrificed their lives so much so that the United States could remain a whole country. And what we're seeing in the 20th century build on the lost cause historians taken up by academic historians is that the warfare conducted by U.S. Grant, butchered, drunk, and above all lucky, is repellent because it seems modern. It seems modern. It's especially in the post-Vietnam War generation. The Vietnam really, I think, affected how historians and how the American people thought of war in profound ways. Much of Grant's military reputation boils down to the meaning imparted to the ability, his ability, to command overwhelming numbers. In other words, the more men you have, the less soldier you are. And it's really so much more complicated than that, as those of you who have studied the Civil War know well. People often fail to understand that Grant's commanding a large army and directing several large armies at the same time might also have been a great test. Is it not something to direct a force of nearly 1 million men, as Grant was in 1864, and several armies over large areas, geographic areas? At least one World War II general agreed. In 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower remarked, quote, "Grant devised a strategy to end the war. He alone had the determination, foresight, and wisdom to do it." In his memoirs, Grant showed that most importantly, it really mattered to him that any Americans and generations of Americans that weren't born yet would be confused or forget about the hardships that his army suffered and the accomplishment of winning the war, preserving the Union, making freedom national. Well, General became president, and the historians of the Lost Cause had their say about that too. This is a picture of Grant's first campaign. The Republican Party is still the National Union Party. They changed their name in 1864, hoping to attract a broader base, but they're slowly transitioning. They're admitting that they're Republicans, candidates who are running. Now, Grant never wanted to be president. He wasn't an outgoing guy. He hated everything about being a politician, the press frenzy, the speech-making, the glad handling, and the extreme hypocrisy involved at every level. Oh, politics has changed, hasn't it? He actually was quite happy in his military position. He had 4 young children. He looked forward to a lifetime of security in the peacetime army. Why then did he become president? I'm sure he asked himself that question many times. Well, the answer that historians have come up with, and I think that one that is validated by the record, is that President Andrew Johnson's mentioned before, disastrous attack on Reconstruction drew Grant's opposition and brought about a unanimous verdict for him at the Republican Convention in 1868. He explained to his close friends who were aghast, especially William Sherman, who hated and loathed politicians, that he had been, quote, unquote, forced into accepting the nomination, he said, in spite of myself. Well, he did it because he was afraid that the goals of the war, union and freedom, would be lost to what he described as mere trading politicians, the swamp. And he was proud of the fact that he was an unprofessional politician, and he entered the White House without political experience, at least in the same kind of experience that most members of Congress would have. But he did have the warm support of a majority of citizens. And if Grant had only served 1 term as president, perhaps the successes of his administration would be celebrated rather than scorned. I really urge all presidents to only serve 1 term, because let's look at the second terms, you know? I mean, there might be exemption with the current one, but we don't know. So what would Grant be known about? What would he be known for? I'm sure maybe a lot of you don't know, but he was known for his strong support of civil rights laws. He consistently supported the equal rights for African Americans, for his strong support in enabling the passage of the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote for African American men. In fact, he supported the 15th Amendment before he was president. When it was coming up for debate, he had a very strong point of view about it, and he believed it was necessary. Now, Grant had a message to the ex-Confederates on the passage of the 15th Amendment because he knew they wouldn't like it, and he knew that it would be difficult. He said this, he actually pleaded with the Southern people, white people. He said, quote, "Treat the Negro as a citizen and as a voter, as he is and must remain. And soon parties will be divided, not on the color line, but on principle." If you can imagine, if you know anything about the history of our country leading up to that point, that is really an incredible statement from the President of the United States. And it happened in a very revolutionary time. Well, he was known for other things. His first term was successful, even though he made mistakes, of course, but he granted amnesty to many Confederates in 1872. And here you have his struggling to fulfill the goals of the war. Reunion, that meant bringing the white citizens back into the United States of America while ensuring some place at the national table for African Americans. It was a hard job, as we know, and it wasn't successful in terms of bringing emancipation to its fullest potential. He presided over a surging and yet, of course, unstable economy. He had a reform program, the first president to stand up in his inaugural address and say, we need to do something about the disgraceful way we have treated Native Americans. We wouldn't like his solution, but he tried to bring some order to that. He also is known for the Treaty of Washington, which peacefully settled the grievances with England over the Alabama claims during the war for their helping to build ships for the Confederates. Now, again, he had missteps. He delegated too much. He was loyal to friends that he shouldn't have been, and yet he was a very popular president among the people. This is his second campaign poster. He changed vice presidents, not uncommon in our history. So did Lincoln. And you see there the appeal to working class Americans. The Galena tanner, his father was in the tanning industry, and Henry Wilson, who was a fierce abolitionist and a fierce partisan for the laboring people of Americans. In 1872, he won handily. In fact, he won 55.6% of the popular vote and 4/5 of the Electoral College, increasing his 1868 margin. And he was the first president in the 19th century to be reelected and serve out his full term since Andrew Johnson. And he received a mandate on his measures, but it all went south, as they say, literally and figuratively in this case, in the second term. Scandals such as the whiskey ring threatened his administration and his reputation. A major depression, always bad when you're president, hit in 1873, obliterated the Northern public's already faint desire to continue unpopular Reconstruction policies, such as interference with Southern elections. Interference meant sending troops to counties in the South, protecting blacks and Unionists who wouldn't be able to vote otherwise. Grant's presidential years was full of frustration and disappointment. In the end, he remained enormously popular, but he felt that he didn't accomplish all the goals that he set out to accomplish. Imagine that happening. Reconstruction's bitter taste shaped the low esteem in which his administration and his reputation has been held. Grant dealt with many issues during his presidency, but he really wanted to bring Reconstruction, make it work, bring the 11 ex-Confederate states back into the Union in a way that would honor the goals of the war. And it just didn't happen that way. And this, as you were apprised of by Professor Persian, I said that on purpose because you said my name rhymes with Persian, so it's Turgeon. This is the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction. I wonder how many of you know that. It's not the same as the Civil War sesquicentennial. It should be, but it's not. And I take as my a great quote from a 19th century novelist and man of letters, William Dean Howells, who said, "What the American public always wants is a tragedy with a happy ending." And frankly, Reconstruction doesn't offer that happy ending. While Southerners and Northern Democrats condemned Grant's attempts to ensure freedom's rewards for African American, the earliest academic historians writing, and this happened in the Progressive era, yes, once anybody could write history. And in the late 19th century, graduate schools were established, so only those of us with PhDs can talk to you about history. And this became established in universities at Johns Hopkins, at Columbia, at Harvard, and in all disciplines. It's an interesting story, but the first generation of academic historians writing about Grant, writing about the Civil War and Reconstruction were almost uniformly hostile to him. And on Reconstruction, they depicted it as being far too harsh on the former Confederates, with negative repercussions on sectional harmony. The most famous of these historians is someone that very few of you would have heard of, William Dunning, Columbia University. But like this, does Dick Smith have anything in common with William Dunning? He influenced generations of students, and generations of students who went out to write influential works of history and textbooks, having an extraordinary low opinion of U.S. Grant. In short, what you had throughout the 20th century was several generations of professors who used the alleged excesses of Reconstruction to explain that we needed those Jim Crow laws, to explain that we needed the KKK, that they were there because of all the outrages that were committed on them by Northern. They needed to disenfranchise the blacks. It's really quite extraordinary to read these history books that a majority of students were reading. So the caricature of Grant in popular perception, this is a cartoon from the time, did not only come from pro-Southern writers, but many Northerners as well. Disliked Grant, disliked the Reconstruction and what's also called the Gilded Age of the 19th century. They made Grant the symbol for post-war America. And Henry Adams' famous quip, "A great soldier might be a baby politician." And here you see that in a cartoon, that he didn't know anything about politics. What was he doing running our country? He was being taken over by the titans of big business. They were running the country. And so these are the kinds of comments that drove the writing of history in the 1930s, in the 1940s, and 1950s. emphasizing only the scandalous parts of Grant's career. Many of them described him as a butcher when they wrote about him in the war. In our own time, the negative portrait of Reconstruction has been turned upside down. The generation of historians heavily influenced by the second civil rights revolution of the 50s and 60s rejected the racist version of Reconstruction, which is now largely presented with African Americans at the center of events. U.S. Grant's presidency, however, has not for the most part been revised upward. And his low presidential rankings throughout the 20th century, and in some rankings continuing the 21st century, are complemented by popular assumptions of his drunkenness, even though I can assure you, eager Beaver scholars have diligently separated rumors from fact and defend Grant against those who unfairly, in their minds, denigrated his reputation. In fact, the definitive last word on Grant's drinking has been researched and written up. Yes, he had a binge or two during his life and even maybe during the war. But the evidence clearly shows that Grant rarely imbibed and never when it counted. This is a very vexing, recurrent issue, and nothing I write or say will necessarily change it. A lot of historians are divided on this, whether he was an alcoholic. We define alcoholic as a disease, alcoholism as a disease, but back in the 19th century, it was something you were ashamed of, and that you were proud of yourself if you could master it. And I think that the fact is that we have to look back on our historical figures and understand they were complex people with great flaws. I understand Winston Churchill drank a lot, but to me, the bottom line is, and John Adams, sorry. Barbara wants me to put in John Adams, who I thought never took a drink. I'm shocked, I tell you. The thing is that the really educated response to me is, would Abraham Lincoln appoint a raging drunk to lead the armies to victory in the Civil War? Well, of course, I must insist you answer no. Television and movies and popular culture endlessly perpetuate Grant the drunk. And I could give you so many examples, but I just want to share with you this one time. Oh, this is an actor who portrayed Grant in a movie. He's rarely been portrayed in movie. In Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, he appeared on the scene for 60 seconds. Does any film buff recognize this? This is Birth of a Nation, Grant in Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith. I know not too many people see it, but this is Donald Crisp portraying him. But I was innocently watching The Family Guy, which I never would normally watch, but my sons love the show. So I was just sitting there, and it was an episode called To Live and Die in Dixie, and I thought, oh wow, that's cool. That must be something about the Civil War. The episode presented a bizarre reenactment of Appomattox in which Grant, wielding a bottle of whiskey, shouts insults at General Lee. After a struggle, Confederate victory is declared, at which point a member of the crowd, looking at this reenactment as depicted in The Family Guy, stood up to defend the great Northern general and said, "That drunken idiot kicked your sorry asses." Sorry. So this is continuing in popular culture. There's a gazillion examples that I could give you, but I think this shows that even in the 20th century it persists. Almost every Civil War professor can testify one of the most commonly asked questions from students and public alike was Ulysses S. Grant a drunk? In the sketch that I have provided of U.S. Grant's reputation, both in history book and to some extent, to a large extent, in popular culture, is it going to go on forever, I ask you? Is it sustainable? Surely, this image of Grant as general and president is out of date, even though it represents, as I said, the general tone of historical literature and in the popular mind. But really, when are we going to get over this? A theory of inevitable Union victory based on numbers and industrial capacity cannot hold water after Vietnam, after Iraq and Afghanistan, and God knows how many wars we're involved in. Surely a portrait of a corrupt Grant administration requires adjustment after this whole thing about it's the most corrupt administration, really, after Watergate, after the Wall Street and Fannie Mae scandals. That's a continuing feature of our life. We should be outraged about it, but it's going to happen again because human beings are up to no good. Surely a few historians might note that under his presidency, black political participation in biracial governments reached levels unprecedented in our history or world history, and was certainly unequaled for nearly 100 years after him. Reconstruction is often described as an unfinished revolution or a splendid failure, and I think that those phrases really capture what it was. Surely those largely negative interpretations no longer square with the newer scholarship emerging. It remains to be seen if a wider audience will accept a reconsideration of Grant's generalship and presidency, and that issue I want to address in part 3 of my talk. You see, I give you the benchmarks along the way. And I want to make a comment here. Grant's historical reputation rarely rises above a stereotype. I have a bone to pick with people about stereotypes. The definition of a stereotype is, quote, a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. Just as Grant in the heroic mode was a stereotype or an exaggerated depiction, so is the negative portrayal that I have sketched out. What is needed and what has been coming and is still arriving is a revision in Grant's image. And I count myself among those historians who have tried to make that happen. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the new work showing this very famous sculpture by the sculptor John Rogers. It's entitled The Council of War, and it takes me to my next part, emphasizing Grant as a soldier statesman. This is a picture of him closely consulting with Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, and of course, Abraham Lincoln. And so gives you an idea of how experienced he was coming to the presidency. The new work that I've read and that I'll tell you just a little bit about before I conclude provides a balanced and convincing major reappraisal both of Grant's military career and his post-war years. In large part, these new works draw deeply from the 30-plus published volumes of the U.S. Grant Papers Project, started in the centennial years, in the 1960s, and now concluding with a soon-to-be published version, the end-all and be-all personal memoirs of U.S. Grant, published in the U.S. papers. That was the first time, as these volumes began appearing, that a massive amount of previously scattered Grant material was now concentrated in one place, allowing scholars such as myself, I have them in my library and I consult them all the time. It's just an amazing source. Overall, from my own research and publications on Grant and reading all the new exciting work on his career, here is the way that I see to a more complicated, rich, and rewarding portrait of this vital historical figure. The first rule is this, that scholars are doing now, and professional historians of many types follow this rule. Stop separating the general from the president. Stop separating the Civil War from Reconstruction. Too often, the careers of a military leader who also has a political career, and one thinks of Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose reputation is now being similarly revised upward, as they think of the military and the political as separate and unequal, a great general but a baby politician. A better way to look at U.S. Grant is not to slice and dice neatly his military and political career, but to approach it as an integrated experience. It makes sense, doesn't it? To emphasize, to perceive, to analyze the continuities in his life as a general and as a president, a soldier statesman. A question should be this: how can we assess the overall development of Grant's judgment and powers of leadership under the extreme pressure that he was under from 1862 to 1865 in terms of how he approached the political side of his career from 1865 to 1876? If we can answer this question with any amount of information, I would contend that the stereotypical image of Grant could be replaced by one in which he emerges as what I would call a quote-unquote essential president. He won't, I doubt that he'll ever make the top 5, but he was an essential president when you think about it seriously. He should go down in history as one of the most important champions of civil rights and a president who kept the Union together during the Reconstruction crisis, during that part of the war that was Reconstruction. And I think because we take it for granted that the United States was going to stay together, we forget about the accomplishment of keeping a country together after a bitter civil war like that. It doesn't happen usually. In the war, Ulysses S. Grant's conviction that the Union was going to be preserved, it's what guided and sustained and animated his military policy. He developed a broad national perspective on the means as well as the end of the rebellion. As a general, he not only planned and executed military campaigns, but he also presided over occupation of the southern population and territory. He formulated and implemented policies and practices that not only predicted Reconstruction, but actually was Reconstruction during wartime. This experience prepared him for the office of the president. He consulted with the highest political officials of the United States over issues on a constant basis and was acutely aware of the political nature of this war. In other words, as Grant moved south in the Mississippi Valley, his army won battles but also occupied territories and liberated thousands of enslaved people. They had to take care of these enslaved people. They had to fix policies. They had to appease the southern whites who came under their occupation. All this was presaging Reconstruction. After Appomattox, U.S. Grant remained a powerful presence. This is a very famous painting called The Peacemakers, again showing how closely Grant consulted with Lincoln as well as Sherman and David Dixon Porter in that painting, talking about Reconstruction just before Lincoln died. After Appomattox, Grant remained a popular presence, officially serving as General-in-Chief, overseeing the military part of Reconstruction policy. He had an investment, he felt, in helping to establish a permanent and solid peace between North and South that he thought Andrew Johnson was destroying. He came to see that Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policy was going to demolish and diminish the fruits of Union victory. And as the General-in-Chief, he was right in the thick of things in Washington, D.C. He was responsible for directing the military part of Reconstruction, and it brought him just right in the middle of an unfolding political crisis in the Johnson administration. And during those years from 1865 to 1868, Grant was understanding the maelstrom of political life in the United States. Republicans disagreed with each other. Democrats hated Republicans. And Andrew Johnson was trying to forge a unity based on a white populism. And it all became very complicated when Johnson fired Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, and Grant replaced him. So for 5 months, Grant served as Secretary of War. And during this time, again, he enacted and guided political policies designed to cement and advance wartime goals. What was happening here was Grant was demonstrating to the country his understanding that the issues of the Civil War would continue to impact public policy of the country for years to come. What this time reveals about the changing views of historians is the powerful connection between Grant's experiences in the Civil War and its aftermath. Overall, some strong emerging themes have come from the new work. Consider this. Except for Lincoln and FDR, Grant shouldered more grave responsibilities than any other chief executive in our history, dealing with the massively complicated job of reconstructing the nation. More and more of the revisionist historians, of which I count myself as one, building on the work of the academic scholarship that has recast and reshaped our modern understanding of Reconstruction, recognize that Grant operated amid intensely racist forces, and in both the North and South, they had enough of Reconstruction. In fact, when you study Grant's campaign against the Klan, when he passed Force Acts and used military power to interfere in Southern elections, historians now find that he had far more commitment to African Americans than his people in the North were willing to give. In short, Grant is now emerging in the pages of history books that you can read as a thoughtful, intelligent, engaged president, fully aware of the responsibilities, duties, and difficulties that were part of the role of the chief executive. Throughout his presidency, Grant remained steadfast in the belief that the goals of the war should be preserved, even as the country's and his northern people's enthusiasm for reconstruction of the South in the North's image faded away. Grant's final task as president harked back to his first and perhaps most important achievement, to ensure a stable transition, this time in the disputed election of 1876. He succeeded, and as we know, the country reconciled. Few, if any, professional politicians, I would argue, could have done better, and most might have done far worse. Like his mentor, the man he considered his political mentor, Abraham Lincoln, his fight was over the future of the Union, only this time the issues were not secession and slavery, but what kind of nation would emerge at the dawn of the 20th century. Currently, in the 21st century, a lot of books have been published. And I would say this, that revise Grant's reputation. If revisionists are as resolute as Grant, then and only then might there be a chance for Grant to resume his place among the most important and honored figures in American history. If justice as well as scholarship is served, Grant's presidential reputation, which is already inching up, will be much higher. He may not be the greatest, but as I said before, he will be an essential president. And I just want to tell you about some recent books to come up to recommend. I'm not going to give you a book report, don't be frightened, students. I'm not going to assign you anything, but Ronald White just published last year a massive new biography of Ulysses Grant. The title is American Ulysses. A very well done book, really excellent to read. Just out in a few days, I think, is Ron Chernow's book on Grant, another massive biography of U.S. Grant. These are the New York City telephone book. Remember telephone books? And I haven't read it yet, but I've heard really, really good things about it. I got the opportunity to meet Ron Chernow, who you might know as the biographer of Alexander Hamilton, and also based on a Broadway play you may have heard of. And I'm looking forward to the hip-hop Grant. What do you say? Yeah, absolutely. There's one other book that I want to recommend to you that I'm just reading now. It's the first major academic study of Grant's presidency since the 1930s. And that would be written by a very respected historian of American 19th century politics, Charles C. Calhoun. So this is very exciting to those of us who are interested in historical memory. But I want to end with this, that Grant's legacy to his own generation was deep and wide. By the time of his death in 1885, Ulysses S. Grant was an icon in a historical memory of war shared by a whole generation of men and women. My book argues that by that time, that to understand that generation, that they believed that an appreciation of Grant could only come with the recognition that he was both the heroic general that saved the Union and the stalwart president that made sure it stayed together. For them, U.S. Grant was already both an American hero and an American myth. Thank you so much.
What I mean about a brilliant insight. The other thing that I hope you all will take away with you, because since 2015 and the murders of African Americans in a church in Charleston, that has started the most recent national discussion about what do those monuments symbolize. So many of the Confederate monuments put up in the 1920s. In the 1920s, at the height of Jim Crow era white supremacy. And so, particularly the part about the lost cause myth, I want you to take that away with you, please, and as we continue to have these national discussions, to think about how much it turned out that the winners did not write the history of Reconstruction. So, and so again, thank Dr. Waugh. She's going to take questions now. Mike's going to take the mic around.
Okay.
So, my colleague...
I don't want to take any questions. No.
Too bad.
Teasing.
You do want them, because they're going to
I
be
do.
great questions, and you're going to have great answers. It'll be
I
lovely.
know. I know.
Mike's going to take the mic around. Anybody would like to ask a question, so put your hand up, and then Mike will...
By the way, Mayor Bill de Blasio has put the Grant monument, the Grant tomb on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the largest tomb in the United States, the second largest in the world, on the list of monuments possibly to be removed. I'm very gratified by that.
After the second term that he had, and then after his triumphal 2-year tour around the world, his popularity seemed to be huge. And there was efforts to have him run for president for a third term. Garfield, however, got the nod. Do you think that A, he wanted it, and B, he could have had it if he tried hard enough?
That's a great question, the third term issue. Grant was probably grateful that he didn't win the presidency, since Garfield was only there, was assassinated. However, the question is, why did Grant want it? He said he hated the presidency. He was so happy to be out. But he let his name be put forward by his admirers, and he could have easily gotten a third term if not for the strength of the opposition against them and the weakness of his supporters. And I can only say that he would have served a third term. I mean, that would be my take on it. What do you think?
I agree completely.
Yeah, I mean, although he was just as happy that he didn't do it. He didn't have much time left. Of course, he didn't know that. We never know.
I'd like to point out that another Civil War hero from Ohio who later became president and was assassinated was William McKinley.
And did you, I'm sorry, did you have a question about that?
No, just a comment.
It is true. Ohio has the second greatest number of presidents. You should be proud, and a lot of them were in the Gilded Age, and including Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley. And yes, William McKinley was a very low-ranking, I think he ended the war as a major, but his big battle experience, which is commemorated in Antietam, have you ever seen his monument there? He's bringing coffee to his regiment. It's a great story.
You talked a bit about the series that ran in the Century magazine in 1883, and their whole ethos was reconciliation.
It was a powerful ethos, yes.
So what I'm curious about, if I understood your talk correctly, you see the negative image of Grant largely being a concession by national press more generally to the lost cause narrative.
Well, I think that, do you mean it at the time of his life or after?
Yeah, so I guess here's what I'm wondering.
I mean, I think reconciliation, that memory, of the four memory traditions, reconciliation among whites became very powerful. And it was even powerful after the war. I mean, Appomattox represented reconciliation. That's why men fought and died to save the Union. And that is why Northern people, bless their hearts, withdrew their support because for them, because this was a deeply racist country, as we know, for them, the most important goal had already been reached, and that was saving the Union. And as long as Southerners accepted their loss, they wanted to fixate on other things. Now, it is a really interesting question about reconciliation and how powerful that was. That was also, it wasn't only the lost cause in the 1920s, it was accepting those parts of the lost cause that Northerners could live with. And we know this from the films, the Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind in 1939. It's a blend of lost cause and reconciliation. It's a very interesting phenomenon in which a lot of Northerners and people around the world, of course, the most watched movie in movie history is Gone with the Wind. The most read novel is Gone with the Wind. It's kind of incredible, its power and its reach. And yes, both of them celebrated the lost cause and were accepted as part of the story.
Yeah, what I'm wondering about with that story is, especially going back to the Century, they were so careful to balance Union and Confederate generals and not to villainize anybody. So I'm very just intrigued by your sense of how on earth did the Northern media start to buy into this negative portrayal of Grant? The Century would not have accepted it.
I mean, again, your question brings up all the vexing complications of our country. And if you have to remember that the North was divided between Republicans and Democrats, it's so different today, right? We're all one country, happily living together. But I mean, and the political infighting was intense and bitter and ugly throughout the war and certainly during Reconstruction, and that Northern Democrats did not like Grant and did not like the Republican Party. Northern Democrats wanted to get as many white ex-Confederates voting as possible and end Reconstruction so that they would have a chance to win the presidency again. The Republicans held on. It's remarkable what happened during Reconstruction in many ways. It's remarkable that this biracial experience existed for as long as it did, actually. But once the Republicans realized that because the Republicans themselves wanted to grant amnesty to as many ex-Confederates as possible of voting age, that was a goal that they had. They passed, even the radicals supported the bills granting amnesty. So it was the complicated nature of the war. And yes, the thing about removing the Confederates' monuments, I think that if they're objectionable to cities or to universities, they have the right to remove them. But in terms of commemorating the battles and leaders, the stories of the history of the war, you need the two sides. You need to know about both sides. You need to know about the motivations of the people in the South and what happened to them after the war. It's a very complicated story. So yes, reconciliation was probably the most powerful and important memory tradition through the 20th century. And now it has changed. Now the memory tradition of emancipation, of the war being about the drive for freedom and African American rights, is very much in the forefront of our minds. And things have changed. I mean, there's lots of sites now that recognize that. The national parks never, you go to Gettysburg 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and you go to the museum at Gettysburg and Antietam, I've been many times, or many others, nothing about slavery as a cause of the war. Today, it's all interpreted the causes of the war because they want Americans to know the history. But you do need both sides. If there's a Grant, you need to know that there was a Lee. And if there was a Lincoln, you need to know about Jefferson Davis. You need to know about what Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens said as the war began, that this war is all about slavery. And then in their memoirs after the war, they said it's not about slavery, it's about state rights. So, I mean, that is important. Don't you think that's important for us to know? And it should be interpreted in many places, and it is, and we should not forget it. I'm off my soapbox now.
Professor, you pointed out a number of parallels between President Grant and President Eisenhower, and those of us who have studied Eisenhower's presidency know that his leadership style was very much behind the scenes and based on the delegation of authority. What was Grant's leadership style as president?
Well, I think he had a similar style. I mean, very different wars, obviously. And I really, just as an aside, I think there are so many interesting parallels between Grant and Eisenhower. The two West Point trained officers who were directed these huge efforts in war and then had 2 terms, and they both thought transportation was important. I don't know if you know that Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he was president, thank you, Dwight, for making it possible for us to go coast to coast. And do you know that he lived in retirement at Gettysburg? He lived behind, yeah. So you know all that. You're an expert. But Grant had a number of traits which we associate with great commanders and in the Civil War. One of them was he was able to move large numbers of troops vast distances in the Civil War. It's really amazing when you look at the theaters of the Civil War, the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. Grant was in both. The Trans-Mississippi Theater. It was a huge battleground. So he did that very successfully. He was also able to be flexible. And in other words, I quote to my students this when I talk about Grant in the Overland Campaign and all the setbacks he suffered. And I quote to them the great philosopher Mike Tyson, who said, "Everybody's got a plan until they're punched in the face." When that happens, as it happens to all of us, I think, in this room, but when it happens to a commander and you get punched in the face, what do you do after that? And that is what he could be flexible, he could think differently. He could adapt and change. And I think that is really, also plays into what you said. He had a staff. He tried to find the best generals he could. The Western armies were his type of armies. They were aggressive. They were fast and hard and lean. Sherman took the Western armies. He gave that job to Sherman because he trusted him so much. He trusted James McPherson. He trusted Phil Sheridan. The Army of the Potomac, that was hard. That was really hard. And it was a little bit like Eisenhower dealing with Montgomery during World War II. And those of you who don't know about that, Montgomery thought he should be running everything. And so, yes, I mean, I think what he tried to do always was to find the best officers and put them in charge. That was really hard to do when he came east and directed the campaign against Lee. That's why he decided to go with George Meade. But it was difficult because this wasn't his army. This was still McClellan's army, slow-moving and heavily politicized.
I think maybe we have time for one more question. Yes.
You mentioned that one of the criticisms that people had of his presidency is that it appeared the businesses were running America. What exactly during the time caused that perception of him?
Oh, business running America. You know, that is, again, these are really great questions. I wish I did, in fact, have 3 hours to talk to you about this, but there was so much happening. The American story is endlessly fascinating to me, and it's characterized by change, dynamic change. 3 laws were passed in 1862 that were the fruition of Abraham Lincoln's dream, the Whig dream and then the Republican dream, the passage of the Morrill Act, which opened public universities, including UCLA eventually, and the passage of the Homestead Act, and the first Transcontinental Railroad Act. All those things designed in the minds of the Republicans to open America's great untapped resources to be used for the benefit of all, for ordinary people, but also for the mines and for the treasures that it would unleash. So, you know, sometimes you get what you wish for and you don't know how to deal with it. Well, that's what happened after the war. Because Grant really was a president of the Gilded Age as well as Reconstruction. And so you had the rise of what we called big business. And big business, symbolized by the railroads, was wildly successful. We know the steel industry and John D. Rockefeller, who did not serve in the Civil War, but was busy building, looking at Titusville, Pennsylvania, and building an oil company. I love this period of history. But the point is that these rapid changes were happening. It made the economy very unstable, made the growth of productivity and wealth, but it was also very scary, and people were worried about it. So that is the Gilded Age generally has another stereotype. People just accept it. It's much more complicated than that. But I hope I answered your question. Thank you very much.